16-year-old Emma has lost her voice, but not her spirit. Mute since a tragic accident, she pours her heart into playing her cherished violin on the bustling streets of the city, hoping to earn enough to buy medicine for her ailing grandmother. But with a ruthless city officer determined to silence her and time running out, Emma's dreams seem to be slipping away. Just when hope feels lost, a mysterious mentor appears, offering her a chance to reclaim her music and discover a gift she never knew she had. As Emma learns to transform her pain into a melody that touches even the hardest of hearts, she must overcome the shadows of her past, the ticking clock, and the bitter enforcer standing in her way. With a scholarship opportunity that could change her life and the threat of losing the one person she loves most, Emma must find her voice, both in music and in life, before it's too late. Based on a true story. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The late afternoon sun dipped behind the city skyline, casting long shadows that danced across the bustling square. Emma stood in her usual spot, her slender fingers wrapped tightly around the worn violin she had inherited from her mother. The cool November breeze nipped at her cheeks, but she ignored it. She had no time to think about the cold, not today. The square was busy as ever, filled with the chaotic blend of honking cars, clattering footsteps, and the hum of conversations. People rushed past her, their eyes glued to their phones or fixed on some distant point, as if they were in a race against time. In a way, Emma was racing against time too. But for her, the stakes were much higher. With a deep breath, Emma raised her violin to her chin and closed her eyes, letting the familiar weight of it anchor her. As she drew the bow across the strings, a soft, haunting melody filled the air, a song her grandmother had taught her years ago. It was a melody filled with longing and hope, the kind that made people stop and listen, at least on good days. But today was different. Today, Emma needed more than just a few listeners. She needed enough money to buy her grandmother's medicine before the pharmacy closed. Each note she played was like a prayer, a desperate plea that someone would stop, that someone would notice her. But as she glanced at her violin case lying open on the ground, she saw only a handful of coins scattered inside. Not nearly enough. The crowd was indifferent, as always. A group of teenagers laughed and pushed each other as they passed by, ignoring the music. A businessman in a sharp suit hurried past, his briefcase swinging at his side, oblivious to the world around him. Emma's heart sank, but she kept playing, her fingers moving faster, her music growing more urgent. Then, just as she was starting to lose hope, a faint flicker of movement caught her eye. A little girl, no older than 6, stood a few feet away, her wide eyes fixed on Emma. She tugged on her mother's sleeve, pointing at the music, but the mother barely glanced in Emma's direction before pulling her daughter away. The little girl's disappointed face lingered in Emma's mind, but she forced herself to focus. The music swelled, and for a brief moment, it seemed to reach through the noise of the square, drawing the attention of a few passers-by. But just as quickly as they had paused, they moved on, their footsteps blending back into the rhythm of the city. Emma's chest tightened. She had to earn more. She couldn't go home empty-handed, not today. "Hey! You!" a gruff voice barked behind her, making her jump. Emma spun around, her heart pounding. It was him, Mr. Graham, the city enforcement officer. His tall, imposing figure cut through the crowd like a knife, his stern gaze locked on her. The badge on his uniform gleamed in the fading light. "What did I tell you last week?" he demanded, stepping closer. "No permit, no performing. You're breaking the law." Emma's fingers trembled on the bow, but she held his gaze. She couldn't speak, she hadn't been able to since the accident years ago, but she tried to convey her desperation through her eyes. If only he knew why she was doing this. But Mr. Graham was not a man easily swayed by silent pleas. "You have until tomorrow," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. If I see you here again without a permit, you're done. Got it? Emma nodded, her heart sinking. She watched him turn and walk away, his figure disappearing into the throng of people. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. Crying wouldn't solve anything. She had less than a day to come up with enough money, not just for her grandmother's medicine, but also to somehow obtain a permit. Both felt impossible. The sun had nearly set, casting the square in an orange glow. Emma glanced down at her violin case. There were still only a few coins. She needed at least 10 times this amount. With a deep breath, she raised her violin again, forcing herself to keep playing, even though the knot in her chest tightened with each passing minute. As she played, her thoughts drifted to her grandmother, Mrs. Allen. The woman who had raised her, the one person who had always believed in her music. Her grandmother's health had taken a turn for the worse recently, and the doctors said she needed a special medication to stabilize her condition. The problem was, the pharmacy wouldn't extend their credit any longer. If Emma didn't have the money by tomorrow, there would be no medicine, and she couldn't bear to think of what would happen then. A sudden gust of wind swept through the square, and Emma's music wavered as her bow slipped. She swallowed hard and kept playing, refusing to give up. But with the crowds thinning and the daylight fading, her hope was slipping away like sand through her fingers. The city's clock tower chimed in the distance, marking the hour. She had maybe an hour left before the pharmacy closed. Just 1 hour to earn enough money. Emma's eyes scanned the square desperately, searching for any sign of hope, for someone who might stop, listen, and be moved enough to help. But all she saw were people hurrying past, their lives moving on, while hers felt like it was unraveling. And then, just when she thought all was lost, a tall, shadowed figure emerged from the crowd, lingering on the edge of her makeshift stage. The man's eyes were hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but his presence was impossible to ignore. He stood there, unmoving, as if he could hear every note she played, as if her music was the only sound in the world. Emma's heart skipped a beat. Could this be the miracle she was waiting for? The walk back home felt longer than usual, every step weighed down by Emma's fear and frustration. The sky had darkened, the city now bathed in the glow of streetlights and flickering neon signs. She cradled her violin case close to her chest, trying to shield it from the biting cold wind that whipped through the narrow streets. Emma reached the worn-down apartment building she called home and climbed the creaky stairs to the 3rd floor. The hallway smelled of stale cooking and dampness, the fluorescent lights flickering ominously overhead. She hesitated for a moment in front of the chipped door labeled 3B, dreading what she might find inside. With a deep breath, she turned the handle and slipped into the dimly lit apartment. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of medicine and the faint hint of lavender her grandmother always liked. Emma's heart clenched at the sight of the frail figure lying on the old, lumpy couch. Her grandmother, Mrs. Allen, was wrapped in a faded quilt, her breathing shallow and labored. "Emma," her grandmother whispered, her voice barely more than a rasp. Her eyes, though tired, lit up with a glimmer of warmth as Emma approached. Emma forced a smile, hoping to mask the worry etched on her face. Setting her violin case on the rickety coffee table, Emma knelt beside her grandmother. She pulled out a notebook she always carried and scribbled quickly, "How are you feeling today?" Mrs. Allen's eyes softened as she read the note. "Oh, you know, the same as yesterday. But don't worry about me, dear. I just hope you didn't stay out too long in that cold." Emma bit her lip, fighting the urge to cry. Instead, she jotted down a new message: "I didn't make enough today." The pharmacy called again. "They need the payment by tomorrow." Her grandmother's frail hand reached out to touch Emma's cheek. "It's all right, love. We'll manage somehow." "We always do," she said, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her own fear. Emma shook her head, frustration burning in her chest. How could her grandmother still believe everything would be okay when they were teetering on the edge? The medicine wasn't a luxury, it was a matter of life and death. And yet, despite her best efforts, all Emma had managed today was a handful of coins, barely enough for a single meal, let alone expensive prescriptions. Mrs. Allen, sensing Emma's turmoil, tried to change the subject. How was the square today? Did anyone stop to listen? Emma hesitated, then slowly nodded. She couldn't bring herself to write about the encounter with Mr. Graham or the threat hanging over her. There was no point in worrying her grandmother any further. Instead, she wrote, there was a little girl who liked the music. Her grandmother smiled weakly. See? Your music still touches people's hearts. Never stop believing in that, Emma. You have a gift. But what good was a gift if it couldn't put food on the table or pay for medicine? Emma forced a smile, though her heart ached with doubt. She quickly changed the subject, writing, I'll make soup. You need to eat something. Emma moved to the tiny kitchen nook, where a lone can of soup sat on the shelf. She opened it and poured its contents into a pot, lighting the old gas stove. As the thin broth heated, she glanced over her shoulder at her grandmother. Mrs. Allen's eyes had drifted shut, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The sight filled Emma with a new sense of urgency. She had only one day left to pay the pharmacy before they cut off her grandmother's medication. Tomorrow, she would have to find a way to make enough money, permit or not. But how? Mr. Graham's threat echoed in her mind. Without a permit, she risked losing everything. The sound of the soup bubbling pulled her from her thoughts. Emma poured it into a chipped bowl and brought it over to her grandmother, gently waking her. Mrs. Allen tried to eat, but after a few spoonfuls, she pushed the bowl away, her strength fading. Don't worry, Emma, her grandmother murmured, her voice barely a whisper. You've done more than enough. You always do. Emma swallowed hard, blinking back tears. She reached for her notebook again and wrote, I'm going to find a way, I promise. Mrs. Allen's eyes fluttered shut, her breathing evening out as she drifted into a restless sleep. Emma watched her for a moment longer, her heart heavy. Then, with a resolve that burned like fire in her chest, she quietly packed her violin back into its case. She couldn't afford to waste any more time. The city outside was still alive with lights and sounds. If she couldn't make enough money during the day, maybe she could find a late-night crowd willing to part with some change. Anything was better than sitting here, helpless, while her grandmother's life slipped away. She slipped out of the apartment as quietly as she could, the sound of her grandmother's labored breaths echoing in her ears. As she stepped into the cold night, she tightened her grip on her violin case. There had to be a way to earn the money, even if it meant risking another run-in with Mr. Graham. Emma's thoughts raced as she made her way back to the city square, the glow of streetlights guiding her path. She was out of options, out of time. Tomorrow was her last chance to make things right, and she couldn't afford to fail. The square was quieter now, the crowds thinning, but there were still enough people to make one last attempt. She set up her spot under a street lamp, the cold metal of the violin biting into her fingers as she readied herself to play. This time, she wouldn't let fear hold her back. She would pour every ounce of her soul into her music and hope it was enough. Taking a deep breath, Emma closed her eyes and drew her bow across the strings, her music rising into the night air like a cry for help. The notes were filled with desperation, each one carrying her silent plea, please, let someone listen. Please, let someone care. The cold night air was biting, but Emma ignored the chill that seeped through her threadbare coat. The square was quieter now, the crowds thinning as the city began to settle into its evening rhythm. The neon signs flickered above, casting a colorful glow on the cobblestone streets. Emma stood beneath a street lamp, her violin case open at her feet with a scattering of coins, hardly enough to buy a meal, let alone her grandmother's medicine. But she couldn't give up now. Not when everything depended on it. She lifted her violin and began to play once more, her fingers stiff from the cold but steady. The melody was a slow, sorrowful tune that seemed to hang in the air, carried on the soft wind. It was a song filled with all the emotions she couldn't voice: fear, hope, desperation. She closed her eyes and lost herself in the music, letting it flow from her heart. For a moment, it felt like the world around her had paused, as if the city itself was holding its breath to listen. And then, just as she reached the most tender part of the melody, she heard it, a soft clap, slow and deliberate. Startled, Emma's eyes flew open. At the edge of the dim light cast by the street lamp stood a tall, shadowed figure. The man wore a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured most of his face. He was the same figure she had noticed earlier, lingering on the outskirts of the crowd. Emma's fingers faltered on the strings, but she quickly regained her composure, finishing the last notes of her song. The man stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking on the cobblestones. He stopped just in front of her, the glow from the street lamp revealing a sharp, weathered face with a pair of piercing blue eyes. "That was quite moving," the man said, his voice deep and rich with a hint of an accent Emma couldn't place. "You have a rare gift." Emma tilted her head, curious but cautious. She couldn't speak to thank him, so she simply nodded, her eyes scanning his face for any sign of ill intent. The man's gaze flickered down to her violin case, where the meager collection of coins lay exposed. "It's a shame that such talent goes unrecognized," he mused, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out a crisp bill and dropped it into the case. Emma's eyes widened at the sight of the money. It was far more than she had earned all evening. She scribbled quickly on her notepad, "Thank you." "But why?" The man's lips curved into a faint smile as he read her message. "Because I know how hard it is to be heard in a world that is too busy to listen," he replied. "You play with a kind of raw emotion that is rare to find. But," he paused, eyeing her violin critically, "your technique needs refining." Emma frowned, clutching her violin closer. Who was this man to judge her playing? But before she could write a response, he continued, "I'm not here to criticize, only to offer a bit of guidance if you're willing to accept it." Her eyes narrowed. She had met many people on the streets, some kind, some cruel, but none had ever offered to help her in such a direct way. She hesitated, then slowly nodded, her curiosity piqued. The man's smile widened. "Excellent," he said, holding out his hand. "My name is Turner, Mr. Turner. I used to be. Well, let's just say I've had a bit of experience in the world of music." Emma shook his hand, her grip tentative but firm. She quickly scribbled, "Emma." "Emma, a beautiful name for a beautiful talent," Mr. Turner said with a genuine warmth that made Emma's cheeks flush. "Now, may I?" He gestured toward her violin. Reluctantly, Emma handed him the instrument, her heart pounding with anxiety. This violin was her most precious possession, the only link she had left to her mother. But there was something in Mr. Turner's eyes that told her he meant no harm. He examined the violin with the careful, practiced hands of someone who was intimately familiar with the instrument. "A bit worn, but it has character," he murmured, adjusting the string slightly before lifting it to his chin. As he drew the bow across the strings, a rich, soulful melody filled the square, so deep and resonant that it seemed to wrap around Emma like a warm embrace. The notes seemed to dance in the air, flowing effortlessly from Mr. Turner's skilled hands. Emma watched in awe, her breath catching in her throat. She had never heard her violin sound like that before. It was as if the instrument had come alive in his hands. "Mr. Turner finished the song with a flourish, lowering the violin and handing it back to her. "You see," he said softly. "Music is not just about playing the right notes. It's about feeling each one, letting it resonate with your soul. You have the heart for it, but you need to refine your craft." Emma stared at him, a million questions swirling in her mind. But she only wrote one, "Why are you helping me?" Mr. Turner's expression softened, a hint of sadness clouding his eyes. "Because I see in you the same fire I once had," he said quietly. "And because... well, let's just say I owe someone like you a debt I can never repay." Before Emma could ask him to explain, he straightened and tipped his hat. "I'm here every evening," he said. "If you're serious about improving, I'll be waiting." With that, he turned and disappeared into the night, leaving Emma standing there, her heart pounding with a strange mix of hope and confusion. She had no idea who this mysterious man really was, but she couldn't deny the spark of excitement that had ignited in her chest. For the first time in days, Emma felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she had found an ally in her fight to save her grandmother. She clutched her violin case to her chest, her resolve hardening. Tomorrow, she would come back. She would learn whatever Mr. Turner was willing to teach. Because she was running out of time, and this might be her last chance. The morning sun peeked through the thin curtains of the apartment, casting a soft glow on the worn-out furniture. Emma rubbed her eyes and rose from the small mattress she slept on in the corner of the living room. Her violin case lay next to her, as if it had never left her side. She glanced at the couch where her grandmother slept, her breath still shallow but steady. It was early, but Emma's mind was racing. She couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Turner, the mysterious man who had appeared out of nowhere, offering to teach her how to refine her music. There was something about him that intrigued her. He had listened to her, seen her potential, and offered her a glimmer of hope when she needed it most. Emma checked the time. She had just a few hours before she needed to head back to the square to meet Mr. Turner. But first, she needed to check on her grandmother. She gently touched Mrs. Allen's shoulder to wake her. Her grandmother's eyes fluttered open, a weak smile spreading across her face when she saw Emma. "Good morning, dear," Mrs. Allen whispered, her voice frail. "You're up early." Emma nodded and quickly grabbed her notepad to write, "I'm going to meet someone who might be able to help with my playing." Mrs. Allen's eyes twinkled with curiosity. "Oh? And who is this mysterious benefactor?" Emma hesitated. She couldn't find the words to explain who Mr. Turner was or why she trusted him so quickly. Instead, she simply wrote, "A kind man who knows a lot about music." Mrs. Allen's smile grew, though it was tinged with a hint of worry. "Just be careful, Emma," she said softly. "Not everyone who offers help does so out of kindness. Sometimes, people have their own motives." Emma nodded, appreciating her grandmother's concern. But something in her heart told her that Mr. Turner was different. He had looked at her as if he understood, as if he had once stood in her shoes. Before leaving, Emma made a quick breakfast of toast and tea for her grandmother. She scribbled another note, "I'll be back before lunch. I'll try to bring something nice to eat." Mrs. Allen squeezed her hand. "Don't push yourself too hard, Emma. I don't need much, just having you here is enough." But Emma knew that wasn't true. She could see the pain in her grandmother's eyes and the way her hands trembled as she lifted the cup to her lips. She needed her medicine, and Emma was running out of time to find the money to pay for it. With her heart heavy but her resolve strong, Emma grabbed her violin case and headed out the door. The square was just beginning to fill with the morning rush of people. Vendors were setting up their stalls, and the air was filled with the scent of fresh bread and roasted chestnuts. Emma weaved through the crowd, her eyes scanning for Mr. Turner. As she reached the spot where she had played the previous night, she saw him standing there, his coat buttoned up against the cold. He looked up as she approached, a faint smile crossing his lips. "Ah, there you are," Mr. Turner said warmly. "I was beginning to think you had changed your mind." Emma shook her head quickly and set her violin case down. She pulled out her notepad and wrote, "I want to learn. Please teach me." Mr. Turner's smile widened. "Good," he said, his eyes gleaming with approval. "You have the heart for it, that much is clear. Now let's see if we can fine-tune those skills." He motioned for Emma to take out her violin, and she did so eagerly. The instrument still felt warm in her hands, as if it had absorbed all her hopes and fears from the previous night. She lifted it to her chin, ready to play, but Mr. Turner held up a hand. "Wait," he said, stepping closer. "Before you begin, I want you to understand something. Music is more than just notes on a page. It's a story. Each note, each pause, each crescendo, it's a reflection of the emotions you carry inside you." Emma nodded, though she wasn't sure she fully understood what he meant. She had always played with her heart, pouring all her emotions into her music. But there was clearly something more Mr. Turner was trying to teach her. "Play for me," he said. "But this time, don't think about the notes. Think about why you're playing. What are you trying to say? What do you want people to hear?" Emma hesitated, then took a deep breath and began to play. This time, she focused not just on the melody, but on the feelings behind it. She thought of her grandmother's frail smile, the way the pharmacist's voice had turned cold when he said they wouldn't extend any more credit, the fear that gnawed at her heart every time she thought about what might happen if she failed. The music that flowed from her violin was deeper, richer than it had ever been before. Mr. Turner watched her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. When she finally lowered her bow, he nodded slowly. "Much better," he said. "Now you're starting to understand." Emma's eyes shone with pride, but before she could celebrate, Mr. Turner reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old, worn leather-bound book. He handed it to her gently. "This belonged to someone very special," he said quietly. "Someone who believed, as I do, that music can change the world. I think it's time you had it." Emma opened the book carefully, her fingers brushing against the yellowed pages. It was filled with handwritten notes, sheet music, and what looked like journal entries. As she flipped through it, a photograph slipped out and fluttered to the ground. She picked it up, her heart skipping a beat. The woman in the photo was young and beautiful, with the same eyes and smile that Emma had seen in her grandmother's old pictures. She scribbled frantically on her notepad, "How did you get this?" Mr. Turner's gaze softened. "Your grandmother was a legend in her time, a violinist whose music could move even the hardest hearts. She left a legacy, Emma, and I believe that gift lives on in you." Emma was stunned. She had known her grandmother had once played the violin, but she had no idea that Mrs. Allen had been famous. It was like a piece of a puzzle she hadn't known existed had suddenly fallen into place. With newfound determination, she met Mr. Turner's gaze and nodded. She would live up to her grandmother's legacy. She would save her, no matter what it took. The chilly wind swept through the crowded square as the city came to life with the bustle of shoppers and office workers rushing to their destinations. Emma stood in her usual spot, the morning sun barely warming her as she tuned her violin. Her fingers were stiff from the cold, but she ignored the discomfort. She couldn't afford to waste a single minute today, this was her last chance. Mr. Turner's words echoed in her mind, "Music is more than just playing notes, it's telling a story." She had practiced late into the night, pouring her newfound emotions into every note, letting her music speak where her voice could not. But today, it wasn't just about playing beautifully. She needed to earn enough money before the pharmacy closed, or her grandmother's condition would worsen. Emma took a deep breath, raised her violin, and began to play. The melody she chose was one of hope and resilience, a song her grandmother used to hum to her as a child. As the music filled the air, passers-by began to slow down, turning their heads to listen. For a moment, it seemed like the world had paused, captivated by the sound of her violin. Coins began to drop into her open violin case, and Emma's heart lifted. But just as she was starting to believe she could reach her goal, a familiar, stern voice cut through the music like a knife. "Well, well, if it isn't our little street performer," Mr. Graham said, his tone dripping with condescension. Emma's fingers faltered, the notes dying on the strings. Her heart sank as she turned to face him. The city enforcement officer stood there, arms crossed, his cold eyes fixed on her. "I warned you yesterday," Mr. Graham said, stepping closer. "No permit, no performing. You're breaking the law." Emma tried to keep her expression steady, but inside, she was panicking. She glanced down at her violin case. There still wasn't enough money. She quickly grabbed her notepad and scribbled, "Please, I just need a little more time. My grandmother is sick, and I need to buy her medicine." Mr. Graham's gaze flickered to the notepad, his expression hardening. "You think you're the only one with problems? Rules are rules, young lady." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "If I catch you here again after today, I'll confiscate that violin." Emma's heart pounded in her chest. Confiscate her violin? The one thing she had left to connect with her mother, to express herself? She shook her head frantically, her eyes pleading, but Mr. Graham was unmoved. "You have until the end of the day," he said, turning on his heel. "After that, if I see you playing here again, it's over." As Mr. Graham disappeared into the crowd, Emma felt tears welling up in her eyes. She fought them back, refusing to let despair take over. She couldn't afford to give up now, not with her grandmother's life hanging in the balance. With renewed determination, Emma lifted her violin once more and began to play. This time, her music was tinged with a hint of desperation. She poured every ounce of emotion she had into the song, her fear, her hope, her love for her grandmother. The melody rose and fell like waves, carrying her silent plea to anyone who would listen. A small crowd began to gather, some people tossing coins into her case, others simply standing there, captivated by her performance. But no matter how hard she played, the money wasn't coming in fast enough. She glanced at the city clock tower in the distance. It was already noon. She only had a few hours left before the pharmacy closed. Her fingers were beginning to cramp, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The sound of the coins hitting the case became a kind of rhythm, each clink a small victory, but still not enough. She was so close, yet still so far from her goal. Then, through the crowd, she spotted Mr. Turner watching her from a distance. His expression was serious, his brows furrowed. He made his way over as soon as she finished her song. "You're pushing yourself too hard," he said softly, concern evident in his eyes. "Take a break." Emma shook her head furiously, scribbling on her notepad, "I can't stop. I have to make enough today." Mr. Turner's gaze softened as he read her note. He seemed to understand the urgency in her eyes. Without another word, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a few bills. "Here," he said, pressing them into her hands. "It's not much, but it should help." Emma's eyes widened in gratitude. She bowed her head to thank him, but he shook his head. "No need for that. Just keep playing, Emma. But remember, it's not just about the money. Play like it's your last performance. Let them feel your heart." As Mr. Turner stepped back into the crowd, Emma's resolve strengthened. She had to make this work. She lifted her violin again, the strings vibrating beneath her fingers, and began a new melody. This one was fierce and urgent, like the ticking clock that was counting down her time. The afternoon wore on, and the shadows grew longer. Emma's hands ached, but she kept playing, her eyes glued to the dwindling crowd. The sun was beginning to set, the light fading, and she knew the pharmacy would close soon. She was running out of time. With one final burst of energy, she played the most powerful piece she knew, a song of hope and triumph. The notes soared into the air, and for a brief moment, everything else seemed to fade away. The city, the cold, even the fear in her heart, it all disappeared, leaving only the music. When the song ended, the crowd erupted into applause, and Emma's chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath. She quickly knelt beside her violin case and counted the money. It was close, so close, but not quite enough. Just as despair began to creep back into her heart, a small, wrinkled hand reached into the case and dropped a handful of coins. Emma looked up to see an elderly woman with kind eyes smiling down at her. "Beautiful music, dear," the woman said softly. "I could feel your heart in every note." Emma's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. She nodded her thanks, unable to express how much this meant to her. With trembling hands, she scooped up the money and rushed toward the pharmacy, hoping she wasn't too late. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon as Emma sprinted through the crowded streets. The coins in her pocket jangled with every step, a bittersweet reminder that she was so close to reaching her goal, yet time was slipping away. The pharmacy would close soon, and she needed to get there before it was too late. Her breaths came in short, ragged gasps as she weaved through the throngs of people who were leaving work for the day. Every second counted. She could feel her heart pounding against her ribcage, her thoughts consumed by her grandmother's frail face. She had to get the medicine, there was no other option. Finally, she rounded the corner and saw the familiar neon sign of the pharmacy glowing in the distance. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. Just as she was about to step inside, a heavy hand clamped down on her shoulder. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She turned to find herself face to face with none other than Mr. Graham. The city enforcement officer loomed over her, his expression as cold and unyielding as ever. "You again," he growled. "Didn't I tell you to pack it up, girl? No permit means no performing, and that includes rushing around town making a scene." Emma shook her head desperately, trying to communicate that she wasn't playing her violin right now, just trying to buy medicine. She reached for her notepad with trembling hands, but before she could write a single word, Mr. Graham's gaze fell on the violin case slung over her shoulder. "Still carrying that thing around?" he snapped. "I warned you about this, didn't I?" Emma's eyes widened in panic. She tried to step back, to explain somehow, but her mute voice betrayed her. Mr. Graham's patience had run out. With a swift motion, he yanked the violin case from her shoulder, opening it roughly. "No!" Emma wanted to scream, but the sound was trapped in her throat. Her eyes filled with tears as she watched in horror. Mr. Graham's eyes narrowed as he examined the old, worn violin. "This is a public nuisance," he said, his voice cold and final. "If you can't follow the rules, maybe it's time I confiscated this." Without thinking, Emma lunged forward, her fingers reaching out to grab her violin. But in the scuffle, the case slipped from Mr. Graham's hands and fell to the ground with a sickening crunch. The sharp sound of breaking wood filled the air. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Emma stared down at the splintered violin lying on the pavement, her heart shattering into a million pieces. The one thing she had left of her mother, the only way she could express herself, now lay broken and useless. Mr. Graham's expression shifted for a split second, as if he hadn't intended for things to go this far. But he quickly hardened his gaze. "Maybe now you'll learn to follow the law," he muttered before turning and walking away, leaving Emma kneeling on the cold ground. Emma's hands shook as she reached for the broken pieces of her violin. Tears blurred her vision, but she tried to gather the fragments as best as she could. Passers-by cast sympathetic glances her way, but no one stopped to help. To them, she was just another street performer who had pushed her luck too far. The pharmacy lights flickered off, signaling that they were closing for the night. Emma's chest tightened. She was too late. All her efforts, all her desperate playing, it had all been for nothing. She had failed. With the shattered violin pieces cradled in her arms, Emma staggered to her feet. She couldn't go home like this. She couldn't face her grandmother with nothing but broken dreams. She stumbled away from the square, her mind numb, her heart a hollow shell. The city had fallen into darkness by the time Emma found herself back at the edge of the square. The vendors had packed up, and the streetlights cast a ghostly glow over the empty space where she had spent so many hours pouring her heart into her music. She felt lost, adrift in a sea of failure and despair. "Emma," a soft voice called from the shadows. She turned to see Mr. Turner emerging from the darkness. His usually confident stride was slower, his expression filled with concern as he took in her tear-streaked face and the shattered violin in her arms. "What happened?" he asked gently, his eyes flickering to the broken instrument. Emma couldn't hold back the sob that escaped her throat. She sank to her knees, her shoulders shaking as the tears finally spilled over. Mr. Turner knelt beside her, not saying anything, just letting her cry. When her sobs had quieted, he placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's just a violin, Emma," he said softly. "A tool, nothing more. Your music, that comes from here." He tapped a finger to her chest, over her heart. Emma shook her head furiously, scribbling on her notepad with trembling fingers, "I've lost everything. I can't play without it." Mr. Turner's eyes softened as he read her words. "You think your music is trapped in that broken wood? No, Emma. Your gift is something no one can take away from you." He paused, then added, "Come with me. I know someone who might be able to fix it." Emma's eyes widened in surprise. Could it really be repaired? But even if it could, she had no money left. She scribbled quickly, "I can't pay for it. I'm broke." Mr. Turner smiled gently. "Leave that to me. Just trust me, all right?" With nothing left to lose, Emma nodded. She followed Mr. Turner through the darkened streets, clinging to the faint glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, not everything was lost. As they walked, the city seemed to transform around her, the cold night air filled with possibilities she couldn't yet see. Mr. Turner led her to a small, dimly lit shop tucked away in a narrow alley. The sign above the door read "Ericsson's Instrument Repair." The shop looked closed, but Mr. Turner knocked on the door with a confidence that suggested he knew exactly who would answer. A few moments later, a grizzled old man with a bushy white beard opened the door. He squinted at Mr. Turner, then at Emma and the broken violin she clutched. "Ah, Turner," the old man grumbled, his voice rough but not unkind. "I was wondering when you'd show up. And who's this young one?" "She's someone who needs your help," Mr. Turner said simply. "I think you'll find her music worth saving." The old man's gaze softened as he looked at Emma. "Come in, then. Let's see what we can do." The warm, dusty scent of wood and varnish enveloped Emma as she stepped into Ericsson's instrument repair shop. The small space was cluttered with musical instruments in various states of repair, violins, guitars, cellos, and even the occasional trumpet. The dim lighting gave the shop an air of mystery, as if it were a secret world hidden away from the bustling city outside. Mr. Ericsson, the grizzled repairman, closed the door behind them and motioned for Emma to set her broken violin on the counter. His rough hands, calloused from years of working with delicate instruments, gently inspected the damage. His bushy white eyebrows furrowed as he carefully examined the splintered wood and snapped strings. "This is a real mess," he muttered, glancing at Emma with a sympathetic look. "But it's not beyond saving." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She quickly scribbled on her notepad, "Can you really fix it?" Mr. Ericsson nodded slowly. "I've seen worse. But it'll take time, and money." He shot a questioning look at Mr. Turner, who gave a slight nod. "I'll cover the cost," Mr. Turner said, his tone firm. "But Emma, you need to understand something. It might take a few days to fully restore your violin." "A few days?" Emma's heart sank. She didn't have that kind of time. Her grandmother needed medicine now. She quickly wrote, I can't wait that long. I need to earn money today." Mr. Turner seemed to understand the urgency in her eyes. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "There's more than one way to share your music, Emma," he said gently. "You have a voice that isn't limited to strings and wood." Emma's brow furrowed in confusion. What was he talking about? Her voice had been taken from her years ago, locked away in silence after the accident that left her mute. But Mr. Turner only smiled as if he knew something she didn't. Turning back to Mr. Erickson, he added, "We'll leave the violin with you. In the meantime, I have an idea." With a reluctant nod, Emma watched as Mr. Erickson carefully took her broken violin into the back room. It felt like leaving a piece of her soul behind. But she had no choice. She couldn't play without it, and without playing, she couldn't earn the money to save her grandmother. "Come with me, Mr. Turner said, guiding her out of the shop and back into the cool night air. "There's a place where we might still be able to make something work." The streets were quieter now, with most of the shops closing for the night. Mr. Turner led Emma to a quieter part of the city square where a handful of people were still lingering. The twinkling lights from a nearby cafe cast a warm glow over the cobblestones. "Tonight, we're going to try something different," Mr. Turner said as he turned to face Emma. "You've relied on your violin for so long that you've forgotten another instrument that you carry with you everywhere." Emma's confusion deepened. She shook her head, writing, "I can't sing. I lost my voice years ago." Mr. Turner's eyes sparkled with a kind of quiet confidence. "No, Emma. You haven't lost your voice. You've just forgotten how to use it." Before she could protest, he gestured toward a small group of people who had gathered near the cafe's outdoor seating area. "Try something for me. Hum the melody you played earlier, the one that always draws people in. Just close your eyes, feel the music in your heart, and let it come out." Emma's instinct was to shake her head and refuse, but the look in Mr. Turner's eyes was so encouraging, so filled with belief in her, that she couldn't bring herself to say no. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and tried to remember the melody. Her lips parted, and a soft, almost hesitant hum emerged. At first, the sound was shaky, like a tiny flicker of a flame trying to survive in a storm. But as she focused on the memory of her grandmother's lullabies, the hum grew stronger, warmer, filling the air with a gentle, resonant sound that seemed to wrap around the listeners like a comforting embrace. The few people nearby stopped in their tracks, their conversations fading into silence as they turned to listen. Emma could hardly believe it. The sound was coming from her, something she hadn't thought possible since the accident. It wasn't singing, not really, but it was more than she had managed in years. Mr. Turner watched with a proud smile as Emma's eyes opened, her gaze widening in disbelief. The small crowd that had gathered began to drop coins into a hat Mr. Turner had placed on the ground. The sound of the coins clinking brought tears to Emma's eyes. "You see?" Mr. Turner whispered as the last note of her hum faded into the night air. "Your music isn't limited to your violin. It's inside you, in your heart. You've just been too afraid to let it out." Emma's hands trembled as she wrote on her notepad, "I didn't know I could still do that. I thought my voice was gone forever." "It was never gone," Mr. Turner replied softly. "Sometimes, when one door closes, another opens. You just have to find the courage to step through it." The crowd slowly began to disperse, but not before several people came forward to thank Emma for the beautiful performance. They left behind more coins than she had managed to collect all day with her violin. It still wasn't enough to pay for the medicine, but it was a start. More importantly, it was hope, a glimmer of light in the darkness that had surrounded her for so long. Mr. Turner looked at the small pile of coins in his hand and then back at Emma. "We're not done yet. With your voice and your spirit, there's more we can do. Tomorrow, we'll find another place to perform." Emma nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and newfound confidence. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she wasn't completely alone. With Mr. Turner's guidance, maybe she could find a way to save her grandmother after all. As they walked back toward the old apartment, Emma couldn't help but smile. She had discovered something new within herself tonight, a hidden strength she never knew she had. And it was all thanks to Mr. Turner, the mysterious mentor who had appeared just when she needed him most. But as they approached her building, the smile faded from her lips. The real challenge was still ahead. They were running out of time, and every moment that passed was one step closer to losing the person she loved most in the world. The first rays of morning light crept through the grimy windows of Emma's tiny apartment. She had barely slept, her mind racing with thoughts of last night's performance. The sound of her own humming still echoed in her ears, a melody that felt like it had unlocked a door she thought was closed forever. She glanced over at her grandmother, who was still asleep, her face peaceful for once. Emma's heart clenched at the sight. She had bought herself a little more time, but it wasn't enough. The money she had earned with her humming performance had barely made a dent in what was needed for the medicine. Emma scribbled a quick note for her grandmother, leaving it on the table beside a cup of tea she had managed to scrounge together from their dwindling supplies. "I'll be back soon. Stay strong, Grandma." With a determined breath, she grabbed her coat and headed out. Today, she would need to push even harder. The discovery that she could hum and still draw a crowd was a lifeline, but she would need every ounce of courage and energy she had left to make it work. The city square was already alive with the morning rush by the time Emma arrived. Mr. Turner was waiting for her, his expression serious but encouraging. "You're ready?" he asked as she approached. Emma nodded, though she couldn't help the flutter of anxiety in her stomach. Today, she had to be even better than yesterday. The stakes were higher than ever. "Remember," Mr. Turner said, leaning closer, "it's not just about the money. You have to reach their hearts. Let them feel what you're going through." Emma took a deep breath, nodded, and began to hum softly. The melody started quietly, tentatively, but as she closed her eyes and thought of her grandmother, it grew richer, fuller, echoing through the square. Slowly, a small crowd began to gather, just as it had the night before. Emma let herself get lost in the music, her soft voice carrying over the hum of the city. Coins clinked into the hat Mr. Turner had placed on the ground, and for a moment, hope flickered in her chest. But just as she reached the crescendo of her melody, a harsh voice cut through the air like a knife. "That's enough. Step away from here." Emma's eyes flew open, her heart sinking as she recognized the stern figure striding toward her. It was Mr. Graham, the city enforcement officer, his face twisted in a scowl. The crowd quickly dispersed, frightened off by his commanding presence. "I thought I made myself clear yesterday," Mr. Graham snapped, glaring at Emma. "No permit, no performing. I won't warn you again." Emma's hands trembled as she frantically reached for her notepad. "I'm not playing my violin. I'm just humming." Mr. Graham's eyes narrowed. "A street performance is a street performance, young lady. Doesn't matter if it's with an instrument or your voice." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "This is your last warning. If I catch you performing here again, you're done." Emma's chest tightened with fear, but she refused to let him see her break. She scribbled furiously, "I'm trying to save my grandmother's life. She needs medicine, and this is the only way I can get it." For a moment, something flickered in Mr. Graham's eyes, something that almost looked like regret. But it vanished as quickly as it came. "I've heard every sob story in this city," he said coldly. "You think you're special? You're not. Everyone's got problems." Emma's frustration bubbled over. How could he be so heartless? She wanted to scream, to tell him how hard she was trying, how much she was sacrificing. But no words would come. All she could do was stare at him, her eyes filled with silent fury. Mr. Turner, who had been standing quietly at the edge of the scene, finally stepped forward. "Graham, you don't have to do this," he said softly. "Let the girl sing. She's not hurting anyone." Mr. Graham turned to face him, his expression hardening. "Stay out of this, Turner. You're not in charge here." The tension between the two men crackled in the air. Emma's eyes darted between them, sensing there was more to their animosity than just her street performance. Mr. Turner's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. "She's just trying to survive," Mr. Turner said, his voice low but firm. "And so were you once, if I recall." Emma's eyes widened. What did that mean? She could see the muscles in Mr. Graham's face tighten, his hands curling into fists at his sides. For a moment, he looked like he might strike Mr. Turner, but then he took a step back, his shoulders sagging slightly. "Fine," Mr. Graham said through gritted teeth. "I'll let it slide today. But if I catch her performing here again without a permit, she's finished. Understand?" Emma nodded, her heart still racing. Mr. Graham turned on his heel and stalked away, the crowd that had been watching quickly dissipating. The coins that had been dropping into the hat had stopped, and Emma's hopes of making enough today were quickly dwindling. "Mr. Turner turned to her with a look of concern. "Are you all right?" Emma nodded, but she was trembling. She wrote shakily on her notepad, "What did you mean? How do you know him?" Mr. Turner sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Graham and we go back a long way. Let's just say we were once very different people. But life doesn't always turn out the way you plan." He looked like he wanted to say more but held back. Instead, he gave her a tight smile. "Don't worry about him, Emma. You focus on what you need to do. I'll handle Graham." Emma wasn't convinced, but she knew she didn't have the luxury of worrying about whatever history was between the two men. She had to focus on raising enough money before it was too late. With Mr. Graham gone, she tried to pick up where she left off, humming softly to attract the remaining passers-by. But the mood had shifted, and the crowd that had been enchanted by her voice was now wary. The coins came in slower, and Emma could feel the weight of every lost second pressing down on her shoulders. By the time the sun began to set, Emma was exhausted. She counted the coins in the hat and felt her heart sink. It still wasn't enough. As they packed up, Mr. Turner placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Don't lose hope," he said softly. "We'll find a way." But as Emma walked back to her apartment, the shadows lengthening around her, all she could feel was the ticking clock inside her mind. Time was running out, and she was running out of options. When she arrived home, her grandmother was awake, her face pale and drawn. Emma forced a smile as she showed her the small amount of money she had earned, but inside, she was breaking. The evening sky darkened, and Emma lay awake that night, her mind swirling with fear. The encounter with Mr. Graham had left her shaken. But it was the memory of Mr. Turner's words that lingered. Sometimes, the hardest battles are the ones you fight within yourself. As she drifted into a restless sleep, Emma made a silent vow. Tomorrow, she would find a way, no matter the cost. The morning sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the city. Emma stood in front of the cracked bathroom mirror in her tiny apartment, her hands trembling as she tied her worn scarf around her neck. Today was her last hope, her final chance to save her grandmother. She had never felt this kind of pressure before, and it gnawed at her like a constant, relentless ache. Mr. Turner had come through on his promise. He had managed to secure her a spot to perform at a small charity event hosted at a local community center. It wasn't a glamorous venue, but it was a chance to earn more money in one night than she could in a week on the streets. If she played well, if she could move the audience the way she had the previous night, maybe it would be enough. Her grandmother was awake, sitting up on the couch as Emma prepared to leave. Mrs. Allen's frail hands were clasped around the cup of weak tea Emma had made her. "You're sure about this, love?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Emma nodded, forcing a smile. She wrote quickly on her notepad, "Mr. Turner thinks it will help. I have to try." Her grandmother's eyes glistened with tears. "You're so brave, my dear. But remember, don't push yourself too hard." Emma leaned down to kiss her grandmother's cheek, the familiar scent of lavender enveloping her. She wished she could stay, wished she didn't have to leave her grandmother alone, but there was no choice. Time was running out, and this was her last chance to gather the money they so desperately needed. The community center was a modest building on the outskirts of town, its peeling paint and worn brick facade a testament to years of service to the neighborhood. Inside, the hall was filled with the chatter of people setting up tables, hanging banners, and arranging chairs. The event was a fundraiser for a local children's charity, and the attendees were a mix of families, volunteers, and a few well-dressed patrons who had come to support the cause. Mr. Turner was waiting for Emma at the entrance, his expression serious but encouraging. "You made it," he said, relief evident in his voice. "Are you ready?" Emma nodded, clutching her repaired violin case tightly. Mr. Erickson had done a miraculous job restoring it, but Emma knew that it wasn't just the violin that needed to perform well tonight, it was her heart, her spirit. She had to reach these people in a way she never had before. "Just remember, Mr. Turner said as they walked toward the small makeshift stage, "this isn't just about the money. Play like it's your last chance to tell your story." Emma's stomach twisted with nerves, but she nodded. The audience was already gathering, taking their seats. She saw children laughing, parents chatting, and a few older patrons eyeing her with polite curiosity. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, letting Mr. Turner's words guide her. The announcer, a kindly older woman with a warm smile, introduced Emma as a talented young musician who has come to share her gift with us tonight. The applause was polite but not particularly enthusiastic. Emma swallowed hard, stepping up onto the stage. She could feel all those eyes on her, judging, waiting. She had to make this count. Emma lifted her violin to her chin and drew the bow across the strings, letting the first notes of her melody fill the room. At first, the music was soft, tentative, as she tried to find her footing. But as she thought of her grandmother lying at home, waiting for her, the notes grew stronger, filled with all the emotion she had kept bottled up inside. The room seemed to hold its breath as her music swelled, the haunting melody echoing off the walls. The chatter died down, and slowly, heads began to turn. Emma closed her eyes, letting the music guide her, letting her heart speak where her voice could not. As the final notes of her song faded into the air, there was a moment of stunned silence before the audience erupted into applause. Emma's cheeks flushed with relief. She had done it. She had reached them. Mr. Turner gave her an approving nod from the side of the stage, and Emma's heart soared. But just as she was about to step down, the doors at the back of the hall burst open with a loud crash. Emma's heart sank as she saw who it was. Mr. Graham stood in the doorway, his expression as cold and unyielding as ever. The crowd turned to see what was happening, murmurs of confusion rippling through the room. "Miss Allen." Mr. Graham's voice boomed, silencing the chatter. "I warned you, no performing without a permit, and yet here you are, disrupting a charitable event." Emma's blood ran cold. She had thought she was safe here, that Mr. Graham wouldn't follow her into a private event. But she should have known better. He was relentless. The crowd looked back and forth between Emma and Mr. Graham, unsure of what to do. Mr. Turner stepped forward, placing himself between Emma and the angry officer. "Graham, this is a charity event," Mr. Turner said, his voice calm but firm. "She's here to help raise money, not cause trouble." But Mr. Graham was unmoved. Rules are rules, he said, his eyes narrowing. I've already given her too many chances. This ends now. The tension in the room was palpable. Emma's hands trembled as she clutched her violin tighter. She had worked so hard to get here, had risked everything, and now it was slipping away. She could feel the tears welling up, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not now. Mr. Turner turned to Emma, his expression pained but resolute. Emma, play one more song, he whispered. Play from your heart. Don't let him silence you. With her throat tight and her heart pounding, Emma nodded. She raised her violin once more and closed her eyes. This time, she didn't think about the crowd, or Mr. Graham, or even the money she needed. She thought of her grandmother, the one person who had always believed in her, who had taught her that music could heal even the deepest wounds. The notes that flowed from her violin were raw, powerful, filled with all the love, fear, and hope she carried inside. The audience was silent, mesmerized. Even Mr. Graham seemed momentarily stunned, his harsh expression softening as he listened. But just as Emma reached the final crescendo, a sudden, sharp pain shot through her bowing arm. The violin slipped from her grip, crashing to the floor with a loud, discordant sound. Gasps filled the room as the fragile instrument splintered on impact, the delicate wood snapping like a twig. Emma fell to her knees, her hands shaking as she reached for the broken pieces. The audience was frozen, the applause that had been building now replaced by stunned silence. Mr. Turner rushed to her side, but it was too late. The violin was beyond repair. Emma's last hope had shattered before her eyes. Mr. Graham looked down at her, a flicker of regret in his eyes before he turned and walked away, leaving Emma kneeling on the cold, hard floor. The evening air was thick with silence as Mr. Turner helped Emma up from the cold floor of the community center. The crowd that had gathered to watch her perform was slowly dispersing, leaving behind a sense of disappointment and confusion. Emma's heart felt like it had been shattered along with her violin, the pieces of which now lay scattered across the floor. Mr. Turner's arm around her shoulders was firm but gentle as he guided her out of the hall. "Let's get you out of here," he said softly, his voice filled with concern. Emma's eyes were red and swollen, but no more tears would come. She felt hollow, numb, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Outside, the city was dark, the streetlights casting long shadows on the cobblestone streets. Mr. Turner led Emma to a quiet bench under a flickering street lamp. She sat down heavily, her hands shaking as she cradled the broken pieces of her violin. "It's all over," she scribbled on her notepad, her writing jagged and uneven. "I've lost everything." Mr. Turner knelt in front of her, his eyes filled with a kind of sadness she hadn't seen before. "No, Emma," he said quietly. "You haven't lost everything. Not yet." Emma shook her head, her expression one of despair. What good was it now? Without her violin, how could she possibly raise the money to save her grandmother? She was out of time, out of options. Before Mr. Turner could say more, the sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. To Emma's shock, it was Mr. Graham, his rigid posture silhouetted against the dim light. His stern face was etched with lines of frustration, but there was something else there too, something that looked almost like guilt. Mr. Turner stood up, stepping protectively in front of Emma. "Haven't you done enough damage for one night, Graham?" he said, his voice low and filled with anger. Mr. Graham's jaw clenched. "I came to talk," he said, his tone unusually subdued. "I didn't mean for it to end this way." Emma stared at him, disbelief flooding her. This was the man who had just ruined her last chance, who had shattered the one thing she had left. Why was he here now? Mr. Turner's expression softened slightly. "Why, Graham? Why do you have it out for her? She's just a girl trying to save her family." There was a long pause, the tension between the two men hanging thick in the air. Finally, Mr. Graham let out a heavy sigh, his shoulders sagging as if under the weight of years of burden. "You wouldn't understand," he muttered. "Try me," Mr. Turner replied, his voice gentler now. Mr. Graham ran a hand through his graying hair, his gaze dropping to the ground. "Years ago," he began slowly, "I was a musician. I played the piano. It was everything to me, until an accident left me deaf in one ear." Emma's eyes widened, the pieces of the puzzle suddenly falling into place. The bitterness, the relentless enforcement of rules, the hatred for street performers, it all made sense now. Mr. Graham continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't play anymore. Music was my whole life, and suddenly, I was broken. I couldn't hear the music the same way, couldn't feel it in my bones like I used to. So I gave it up. I turned to enforcing rules because, well, it was easier than facing what I'd lost." Mr. Turner's expression softened as he listened. "But why go after people like Emma? Why not help them instead?" Mr. Graham's eyes flicked to Emma, who was still clutching the broken pieces of her violin. For a moment, his hardened gaze softened. "Because when I see someone like her, it reminds me of everything I lost. It's easier to shut it down than to face it." Emma couldn't believe what she was hearing. Mr. Graham had been like her once, driven by a passion for music. But instead of fighting to keep his love for music alive, he had buried it beneath layers of bitterness and rules. Taking a deep breath, Emma scribbled something on her notepad and held it out to Mr. Graham. "You haven't lost everything. You can still hear. You just have to listen differently." Mr. Graham stared at the note, his eyes glistening. For a moment, he looked like he might break down, but then he took a step back, his expression hardening again. "Maybe you're right," he said gruffly. "But it doesn't change anything. Rules are rules." Before Emma could respond, Mr. Turner stepped forward. "What if we made a deal, Graham?" he said, his voice calm but firm. "One last chance for Emma. If she can move you, even with your limited hearing, then you let her go. You allow her to perform freely." Mr. Graham hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "And if she can't?" "Then she'll stop," Mr. Turner said. "I'll make sure of it." Emma's heart raced. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. But she also knew she had nothing left to lose. She looked at Mr. Turner, who gave her an encouraging nod. Without her violin, she only had one option left. Emma took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and began to hum. At first, the sound was soft, almost hesitant. But as she focused on the emotions swirling inside her, fear, hope, desperation, it grew stronger. Mr. Graham stood there, his face a mask of disbelief. But as Emma's humming filled the air, something seemed to shift in him. His expression softened, his eyes glistening with tears he tried to blink away. The melody seemed to reach him in a way that words couldn't, touching something deep within his heart. When she finished, the silence that followed was so profound it seemed to swallow the city sounds around them. Emma opened her eyes to find Mr. Graham standing there, his hands trembling slightly. I felt that," he whispered, almost to himself. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "All right. I'll let her go. But this is your last chance, Emma. Make it count." Emma's knees nearly buckled with relief. She had done it. She had reached him. But there was still so much more to do. Mr. Graham turned to leave, but before he did, he glanced back at Emma. "Don't waste your talent, kid," he said softly. "You've got something special. Don't let it slip away like I did." As he walked away, Mr. Turner turned to Emma, a proud smile on his face. "You did it," he whispered. "You showed him the power of music, even without words." Emma nodded, her heart filled with a newfound sense of hope. She had reached Mr. Graham, but now she needed to reach the world. And with Mr. Turner by her side, she knew she could do it. But the clock was still ticking, and her grandmother was still waiting. Tomorrow, she would need to find a way to raise the money she needed. And this time, failure was not an option. The morning air was crisp and cold as Emma made her way through the bustling streets toward the grand concert hall. Mr. Turner had secured her a slot to perform at a prestigious charity event, a rare opportunity that could change everything. If she could impress the patrons tonight, it might be enough to save her grandmother, and herself. Emma's nerves were on edge as she clutched her repaired violin case, her mind racing with a mix of hope and fear. The confrontation with Mr. Graham was still fresh in her mind, but his unexpected show of support had given her a small glimmer of hope. Now, she had one final chance to prove herself. Tonight, everything changes, she thought to herself, trying to muster courage. This was her last shot, her final chance to earn enough money before the pharmacy cut them off for good. The concert hall was an imposing structure, its tall columns and grand staircase giving it an air of elegance and authority. Emma had never stepped foot in a place like this before. The ornate chandeliers, polished marble floors, and velvet curtains were a world away from the gritty streets she was used to. Mr. Turner was waiting for her at the entrance, dressed in a sharp suit. "You made it," he said, his eyes sparkling with encouragement. "Are you ready?" Emma nodded, though her stomach was twisted in knots. She hadn't eaten all day, her nerves had made it impossible. She was afraid that if she tried to swallow anything, it would just come back up. "Good," Mr. Turner said, gently squeezing her shoulder. "Tonight is your night, Emma. Remember, this isn't just about playing perfectly. It's about reaching their hearts. Let them feel what you're going through." Emma nodded again, clutching her violin case tighter. She could hear the murmur of voices and the soft clinking of glasses from the reception hall beyond. The event was filled with well-dressed patrons, business leaders, philanthropists, and even a few influential figures from the music world. If she could impress them, it might open doors she never imagined. But the stakes were higher than just gaining recognition. The money raised from tonight's event could determine whether she'd be able to buy her grandmother's medicine in time. She couldn't afford to mess up, not when everything was riding on this performance. As Emma stepped into the grand hall, her breath caught in her throat. The space was filled with rows of seats draped in red velvet, and a massive crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the room. The audience was already seated, waiting for the evening's entertainment to begin. Mr. Turner led Emma backstage, where a few other performers were waiting their turn. He leaned down to whisper in her ear, "There's someone very special in the audience tonight, someone who can change your life if you impress them. But don't think about that. Just focus on your music." Emma's eyes widened. She wanted to ask who it was, but there was no time. The announcer had already taken the stage, introducing her as the next performer. Her heart pounded as she made her way to the center of the stage, the bright lights nearly blinding her. Taking a deep breath, she glanced at the sea of faces before her. She could see the expectant expressions, the polite but distant looks of wealthy patrons who had seen it all before. Her hands shook as she lifted her violin, but she forced herself to focus. "This is for Grandma," she thought, closing her eyes. The first notes of her melody filled the hall, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. The room seemed to hold its breath as her music rose and fell, each note infused with the emotions she had been carrying for so long: fear, hope, desperation, and love. For a moment, it felt like the world had fallen away, leaving only her and the music. The violin's voice was strong and clear, reaching into the hearts of the audience, drawing them in. She thought of her grandmother, of the nights spent playing by her bedside, and let that love pour into her performance. But just as she reached the crescendo, disaster struck. A sharp, shooting pain ran through her bowing arm, and her grip faltered. The bow slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor with a loud, jarring sound. Gasps filled the room, and the spell she had woven over the audience was shattered. Emma's heart plummeted. The humiliation was a physical ache, a sharp twist in her chest. She could feel all eyes on her, the judgmental stares of the wealthy patrons who had expected perfection. Her hands trembled as she bent to pick up her bow, her vision blurred by tears she struggled to hold back. From the corner of her eye, she saw Mr. Turner standing at the side of the stage, his expression filled with concern. He gave her a subtle nod, urging her to keep going. Taking a shaky breath, Emma lifted her violin again. She closed her eyes, letting the world fade away, and began to hum the melody she had been playing. The sound was soft at first, almost a whisper, but it grew stronger as she poured every bit of her soul into it. The audience, who had begun to shift uncomfortably in their seats, slowly stilled. The haunting sound of her humming filled the hall, even without the violin. It was a sound filled with raw emotion, a story told without words. In the front row, an elderly woman wiped away a tear. Emma could see the faces in the crowd softening, their expressions changing from impatience to something like awe. She had captured them, even without her violin. When the final note faded, the hall was silent. Then, like a wave, the applause began to swell. It started slowly, tentatively, but soon grew into a thunderous ovation. The patrons were on their feet, clapping and cheering. Emma could hardly believe it. She had done it. She had reached them, not with perfection, but with heart. She bowed deeply, tears streaming down her face, and for the first time in a long while, they weren't tears of despair. Backstage, Mr. Turner enveloped her in a hug, his eyes shining with pride. "I knew you could do it," he whispered. "You've shown them what true music is." As the applause continued, a tall, distinguished-looking man in a dark suit approached them. He introduced himself as Mr. Langston, a prominent figure in the music world. "That was extraordinary," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "I've never heard anything quite like it." Emma stared at him, her heart pounding. This was the moment Mr. Turner had hinted at, a chance for a real future in music. "I would like to offer you a scholarship to our music academy," Mr. Langston continued. "You have a rare talent, one that deserves to be nurtured." Emma's breath caught in her throat. A scholarship? It felt like a dream, one that could change everything. But even as her heart soared, she couldn't forget her grandmother waiting back at home. She still needed the money for the medicine. She glanced at Mr. Turner, who nodded reassuringly. "You've earned this, Emma," he said softly. "Go take it." Emma's hands were still shaking as she accepted the offer, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her. She had won a chance at a brighter future, but the clock was still ticking, and her grandmother's health was still in jeopardy. As she left the concert hall, the night air felt colder than before. She had taken a step forward, but there were still battles left to fight. Tomorrow, she would face them. But tonight, she had won a small victory, and for now, that was enough. The applause from the concert hall still echoed in Emma's ears as she walked briskly through the darkened streets. The scholarship offer was like a dream come true, a chance to learn, grow, and finally escape the crushing weight of poverty. But as she clutched the envelope containing her modest earnings from the event, reality crashed down on her. The scholarship was a blessing, but it wouldn't pay for the medicine her grandmother desperately needed tonight. The pharmacy would be closing in less than an hour, and she still wasn't sure if she had enough money. Mr. Turner walked beside her, his face filled with pride and concern. "You did it, Emma. You moved those people tonight. You've proven that your music can change lives." Emma nodded, her throat tight with a mix of exhaustion and anxiety. She scribbled quickly on her notepad, "I have to get to the pharmacy before it closes. Grandma needs the medicine." Mr. Turner's expression turned serious. "Let's hurry," he said, his voice steady. "We can't waste any time." The city seemed to conspire against them as they rushed through the crowded streets. A sudden downpour turned the sidewalks slick and treacherous, slowing their progress. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she checked the time. The pharmacy would be closing in less than 15 minutes. As they rounded the corner, the familiar neon sign of the pharmacy came into view. Relief surged through Emma, but it was short-lived. Standing at the entrance, blocking the doorway, was none other than Mr. Graham. Emma's steps faltered. Why was he here? Panic gripped her as she thought of all the times he had threatened her, tried to shut her down. But as she got closer, she noticed something different about him. His usually stern expression was softened, almost hesitant. Mr. Turner stepped forward, placing himself between Emma and Mr. Graham. "Graham, this isn't the time," he said firmly. "She needs that medicine. Let her through." But Mr. Graham held up a hand, his gaze fixed on Emma. "Wait," he said, his voice unusually gentle. "I heard what you did tonight, Emma. I stayed to listen after I left the hall." He swallowed, as if struggling with what he was about to say. "You reminded me of why I fell in love with music in the first place." Emma's eyes widened. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. This was the same man who had tried to crush her dreams at every turn, and now he was standing here, looking almost apologetic. "I know I've been hard on you, Mr. Graham continued, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I've been holding on to bitterness for so long that I lost sight of what really matters." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled envelope. "Take this. It's not much, but it's what I can give." Emma's hands shook as she took the envelope. She opened it to find several bills, enough to cover the cost of the medicine and then some. She couldn't believe it. Mr. Graham, the man who had been her greatest obstacle, was now helping her in her darkest hour. "Thank you," she scribbled on her notepad, tears streaming down her cheeks. Mr. Graham simply nodded, his eyes glistening. "Go," he said gruffly, turning away to hide his own tears. "Get what you need for your grandmother." Emma didn't waste another second. She and Mr. Turner rushed into the pharmacy just as the clerk was preparing to close up for the night. With the money Mr. Graham had given her, along with her earnings from the concert, she finally had enough. The clerk quickly filled her prescription, handing over the medicine with a kind smile. "Good luck," he said softly as she turned to leave. "I hope it helps." Emma and Mr. Turner raced back to her apartment, the rain now pouring down in sheets. By the time they reached her building, they were both drenched, their clothes clinging to their skin. But none of that mattered. Emma's only thought was of her grandmother. She burst through the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Mrs. Allen was lying on the couch, her breathing shallow, her eyes fluttering open at the sound of the door. "Emma," she whispered, her voice weak. Emma dropped to her knees beside her grandmother, quickly showing her the medicine. "I got it," she wrote in shaky letters. "You're going to be okay." Mrs. Allen's eyes filled with tears as Emma administered the first dose, her hands trembling with relief. The color slowly returned to her grandmother's cheeks, and for the first time in days, her breathing began to steady. "You did it," Mrs. Allen whispered, her eyes filled with pride. "I knew you would." Emma nodded, unable to hold back her own tears. She had done it. Against all odds, she had found a way. As the storm raged outside, the small apartment was filled with a warmth that had been missing for so long. Mr. Turner sat quietly in the corner, a soft smile on his face as he watched the reunion between Emma and her grandmother. "You have a gift, Emma," he said softly. "And now you have a future, too. That scholarship. It's your ticket to a better life." Emma's eyes widened. In the rush to save her grandmother, she had almost forgotten about the scholarship offer. She quickly wrote on her notepad, "But what about Grandma? I can't leave her alone." Mrs. Allen shook her head, her eyes shining. No, Emma. This is your chance. I'll be fine, especially now that I have the medicine. You need to go. You need to live your dream. Emma's heart ached at the thought of leaving, but she knew her grandmother was right. This was the opportunity she had been waiting for, the chance to honor the legacy her mother had left behind. With the scholarship, she could learn, grow, and one day, return to take care of her grandmother in a way she had never been able to before. Mr. Turner placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. You'll never be truly leaving her, Emma. She'll always be with you, in your music. Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face as she hugged her grandmother tightly. This wasn't the end, it was the beginning of something new, something beautiful. A month later, Emma stood on the stage of a grand music academy, her violin in hand, ready to begin her first performance as a scholarship student. The hall was filled with people who had come to hear the new rising star, but as she looked out into the crowd, she saw two familiar faces, Mr. Graham and Mr. Turner, sitting side by side. As she lifted her bow and began to play, Emma let her music speak for her. It was a song of hope, of love, and of redemption. It was a song for her grandmother, who had always believed in her, and for the people who had helped her along the way. The applause that followed was thunderous, but it was the quiet smile on her grandmother's face that meant the most. Emma had found her voice, and with it, she would change the world, one note at a time.